Okay, so I thought today inside of Avid Media Composer we could talk about color correction. So a couple things about doing color correction inside of Avid. First off, there are a lot of people who will do color correction outside of Avid Media Composer. They will go into DaVinci Resolve or some other program that is dedicated to doing color correction. But the color correction tools in Avid Media Composer, particularly the ultimate version of Avid Media Composer, is pretty robust and it is pretty strong, and you can do some amazing things inside of Avid. It works similar to other programs like Premiere or Final Cut or whatever it may be, but it can do some great things comparable to DaVinci Resolve as well. So, secondly, I'd like to first give a disclaimer that I am not a master color correctionist. I haven't spent a long time doing color correction. I know enough to be dangerous, but by no measure am I a perfectionist at color correction. But I will tell you how color correction works inside of Avid Media Composer, and if you are someone who yearns to be great at color correction, there are some other courses you could take to learn about color theory and some great ideas doing side color correction. Now, we are working in Avid Media Composer Ultimate in this version right here, so I will say that Avid Media Composer Ultimate does come with the Symphony options. And so this version comes with Avid Media Composer Ultimate, which includes the Symphony options. The Symphony was a different version of Avid. Years ago, there was Avid Media Composer, there was Avid Express, which was kind of a stripped down version of Avid Media Composer, and then there was Avid Media Composer or Avid Symphony. And Avid Symphony had all these great color correction features. Media Composer also had some great color correction features, but Symphony had more. So this is Media Composer Ultimate, which includes all of those more features that existed inside of Avid. I'm going to teach this course as though we weren't using the ultimate version of Avid Media Composer. I'll keep the ultimate version available and show you some of the differences between them, but if you're not using Media Composer Ultimate, or if you don't have the Symphony option, you'll still be able to do amazing color correction inside of Avid. So let's get started. We are going to start with some footage I put here on a timeline, so I do have some footage here. Some of this is okay, some of this is obviously poorly color corrected, and some of this needs some work here. But I first want to talk about some ideas of how color works inside of Avid Media Composer and how it's kind of set up. So we do have a section over here, a workspace for color. So if you're going to be doing color correction inside of Avid Media Composer, you can choose color and go into the color workspace, which gives you this 3-window display as well as these controls down here. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller and make this a little bit bigger and make these windows a little bit bigger as well, just so we can see a little bit more of what's going on in the screens. Right now the screens are set up to previous, current, and next. So if you are in a clip here on B-roll number 6 here, you will see that there's a previous screen and a next screen, so you can kind of match color between those screens. In case they didn't match in terms of color, you could actually have a visualization to look. Each of these include a pull-down menu, which will allow us to look at different scopes and different displays, which we'll look at in a moment. But for now, we're going to switch back to previous and leave this as previous, current, and next, and talk about some basic controls. Now, one of the ways that Avid does color correction inside of Media Composer is to do color correction as an effect. Now, with the Media Composer Ultimate version, you can also do it here to the source segment or to the source clip name or to the master clip or even the program track or the program segment. There's some other different ways of doing color correction to an actual clip on the timeline. In this case, what we're going to do is not use source tape or source name or clip name or subclip or whatever it may be. We're going to choose color correction effect. And the reason we're going to choose color correction effect is because that's the way the basic version of Avid Media Composer works. It does it as an effect, which is kind of normal for most programs, I would think. So we're going to apply it as a correct, and we're going to use this as a correct. Now, there's a bunch of controls here. There's a section here called HSL for hue, saturation, and luminance. There's a correction called channels, which you can control channels. There are levels. There are curves, and there are secondary color correction controls. Inside of HSL, you'll see that there's a controls section, a hue offsets, and a luma ranges. And so you can control those inside of curves. You'll see there's curves of different curves, etc. Under levels, you can see different composite in red, green, and blue, and the master levels there. And every one of these controls, even all the controls inside of here, you will see has a little switch inside. And the little switch will turn this on or turn this off. So if we want to turn on the HSL controls, we can turn on the HSL controls. And the second we do that, boom, an effect applies onto this B-roll. So let me undo and do that again. And even if I went here to the contrast control and said HSL controls under the master controls and controlled the contrast, boom, as soon as I make one singular change on there, it can apply effect. Now you could go up here into the effect palette and you could say, hey, let me go to color correction and say apply, or let's go to the image effects and apply a color correction effect on here like this. but that's kind of silly. In this case, what we want to do is we want to go into color correction as a workspace, either from here, or you can go to Windows Workspace and choose color, and swap from edit here to back to Windows Workspace's color. Again, it's probably a lot more convenient right here, let's be honest. And you could hit one of those buttons and do it like there and apply color correction. So let's start simply. We'll start with the color correction controls. We have color correction controls for hue, saturation, and luminance, and we're going to look at hue, saturation, and luminance controls. And obviously I don't have to click this to turn an effect on. I can just click one of these and it turns the controls on, and we'll turn the effect on and make that manipulation there like so. So let's undo again. We'll just come back here out of this and we'll go straight here. So inside of there, I want to control the HSL controls, and this will be basically to control the hue, saturation, and luminance. So let's look at this shot, and let's look at, for example, this shot right here. And we could look at this shot and kind of peer through the shot and see what this looks like in terms of brightness, and we could make some guesses here. You'll see there's a hue, a saturation, and a brightness, and a contrast controls under the controls for the master controls. And so inside here, we can adjust hue, saturation, brightness, and contrast. Inside of there, there's even a button to invert the chroma and invert this image, which is weird, and even invert the luma, which just makes this a photo negative. Crazy. So we can make it like that. But again, we don't necessarily need to do that per se. If you ever want to reset any of this, you can hold on the Option key, and the Option key, rather than turning it on or turning it off, will reset everything back to its default situation. So those little switches, you can always reset them by hitting the Option key. So inside here, we have some controls, and we're going to look at basically the brightness of this image and see if we can make some adjustments to the brightness of this image per se. And so for this, I'm going to say, let's just remove this effect here for a second, and we'll start blank, we'll start fresh, and I'm going to look at the brightness of this image. So I can have an ability to adjust the brightness. And this is a global brightness for the master. You see here it says master, which means it's adjusting every single pixel. So it's making every single pixel brighter and controlling the brightness of everything in the image there. Super bright, great, or super dark. You can dial in a number if you wanted to. You could dial in like 50 or something like there and make it that brighter. You could go in small increments and, decimal places of increments. Very small adjustments. You can click and drag this, obviously. And you can hit, the up and, clicking this, and we can make these adjustments here. I thought the up and down arrows would do it, but no, the adjustment up and down arrows right now I have mapped to zooming in and out of my timeline. So that's my adjustment. I'm going to hit the Option key again and reset this back to normal. I'll reset all this and we'll be back to normal here. We still have an effect in here, but it's not really doing anything, so it's pretty much a pointless effect here. But now what we want to do is we want to start to look at some of our controls here in terms of brightness and what our brightness really looks like at these images. So let's take a look at how these images look. And before we get into that, I do want to talk a little bit about our brightness scale. So we're going to go here to previous, and instead of previous, I'm going to switch to either our Y waveform or our YC waveform. If you know about the different channels that are existing inside a video, you have Y and C. Y often refers to luminance, and Y and C refer to luminance and chrominance. So we don't want to look at the color values right now. We're just going to look at the Y waveform values and look at the Y waveform, and this is going to give us our waveform monitor. Now our waveform monitor is set here at a scale of 0 to 100. And so here it has a range of 0 to 100. On the other side, it has a range of 16 to 235. We will talk about that number later at some point. Not now. Cool. And we're going to go here and look at this. Stop that. And look at 16 by 235 and look at that number. That is the bit depth number. Not actually the bit depth, but it's actually how the bit depth calculates in terms of contrast. And so now we're looking at contrast levels and looking at the contrast levels that are available. The lowest we want to go for broadcast, the lowest we want to go here is to 16, which is equivalent to 0 on a 0 to 100 scale. And the highest we want to go to is 235. Well, if you notice here that this image is pretty okay, pretty decent, but we're not getting really enough darks in here. We're not getting a really dark enough image inside of here, and we want to kind of create those kind of rich blacks and have those there. So now I'll show you, if we raise the brightness on this image, and we crank up the brightness, you'll see that all of these will move up to here. And this will actually extend beyond the 235. So this will extend into this white area here, and this white area says, hey, we are way too bright. Some of these pixels are way too bright, and this won't broadcast properly because we need to be in a broadcast safe range. So our broadcast safe range, we can bring this down and not have this extended. The other thing we could do is over here in the corner there is a clip level, and this clips us at 16 by 235. Notice that this is not on by default. So this would be kind of a broadcast safe, clip us off, and this will eliminate those frames, or eliminate those brightness area. And so, boom, we say clip, and then boom, and you'll see a minor difference up here in the top areas up here where it's super bright. It gets a little darker in certain areas. You'll see in certain places, particularly right in here where the water is or the fake water is, when we clip this, it just kind of cuts those off and makes those fit. Now, is that a good color correction? No, because all those pixels are flattened out, which means if there was any detail in here, we just lost it because we just clipped it off. And we just flattened it out and clipped it off. The top of this building has no more detail on it there. But obviously, we don't want to brighten this up past here. So I'm going to option click this and bring this back down to where it was. And I really want to concern myself with the dark. So now we have two controls here. We have a brightness and contrast. And this brightness and contrast is going to control basically our luminance. So here I can bring the brightness down a little bit and bring it down to there. That would make it darker overall. Again, if I make it too dark, you're going to see I'm going to clip down to here. Now I've lost all the detail here. Can I clip this off? Yeah, I can clip this off and say, hey, don't go too dark. Boom, and I just controlled it from getting too dark. You'll see here it just lost in the darkness, and I've clipped this there. But again, I don't want to do that like crazy. I keep hitting Alt and going back to normal. I know, I'm just showing you how it works and showing it there. But I want a decent level of brightness inside of here, but I do want to make this a little bit darker. So let's bring this down in small increments, down to about here. And we're going to just go in small increments. Well, that takes too long. So we're going to go here and drag down and go back to there. Now, between the brightness and contrast, we could say, let's brighten this up and let's raise the contrast. This will stretch out the tops and bottoms of this. So up here, we're going to stretch this out and kind of make this bigger. Now, if we stretch this out too much in the bottom, guess what? We're going low. We'll turn the clip off just so we can see. Oh, yeah, not good, not good. So let's go raise the brightness up. And there's a little bit of a trickery here between raising this up and stretching this down, in this case, just to fit inside of there. Now, you will maybe see some hot spots, but now we just lower this a little bit so the bottoms of these are hitting down here. Again, not too dark. There's too dark. Right there. Stretch it out a little bit more. Stretch it out a little bit more, because I really want to take advantage of the full contrast range. So I'm playing these a little bit like there, hitting this at the top and bottom. We can look at this and say, let's turn this off for a second. We'll turn off these master controls, and that's what it looked like before. This would look like now. So we have a little bit of better contrast range. Just a slightly some richer dark, some better black levels. I feel better about this as an image. Now, if you wanted this to be particularly dark for some reason, you know, certain scenes, horror movies, you may not want everything to be super, have the full luminance range. You might want to go for a super darkness, but we can kind of handle that after the fact. But for now, just to set this up by default, we can say, hey, looks great. Yeah, looks a little bit richer. Yeah, I mean, we can go crazy contrast and then, you know, super dark and then a lot of contrast or something and really make it like a Batman movie or something, but we don't want to go there. So let me undo what I just did because I really had it nice. Let's look at some of these other images. So for each of these images, we're going to look at contrast and look at the luminance values and see if we can get a good range. So again, this image, man, it's not coming down low enough and it's not getting high enough. I really want to boost this up here. So in here, we have controls to boost the brightness. We can make this brighter. You notice it brings everything up, but then I want to stretch the contrast range and make this bigger. Brighter, bigger. There, I'm getting a little bit of dust up here above 235, but I'm going to let that go, or maybe I'll deal with it just slightly, bring it down a little bit, and again, really have that good range there. Really take advantage of the range, really have a good, well-detailed image by being able to see the full range there. Now, that's one way of doing it, is adjust it there. Let's look at another image. Let's see what we have here in terms of there, and let's look at this image, for example. Now, there's also over here the gain, gamma, and setup controls. I sometimes will prefer the gain, gamma, and setup. This is a different way of doing it. It works. I wouldn't use both of this and this at the same time. That's just me. Some people will. I won't, because I feel like these are doing the same thing that brightness and contrast are doing. Gain, gamma, and setup looks at this a different way. And what it says here is that, okay, if I increase the setup, this is almost like increasing the brightness. This is going to push from the bottom and raise this whole thing up. So it's just going to raise this whole thing up and raise it up like this and make it all brighter. So that's one adjustment here. And the gain basically pulls from the top. So we can put the setup here down at the bottom and say, hey, we're going to pull the setup down to here just so it kind of reaches right there. And the gain is going to say, let's grab up from the top and pull this and make this bigger and drag up the top here. And that's a different way of doing it. Now the question will be, well, if you have setup and you have gain, you can just use gain and setup. What's gamma do? Well, gamma sometimes pulls from the middle. And the gamma for the setup would be in a situation where you have some stuff in the mid-ranges that just ends up looking really dark. And so it will pull kind of from the mid area. And you can almost see this if you pull the gamma here from the middle. It'll pull the kind of bottom of this up. Notice the gamma doesn't make the image too bright. A lot of times you want to make the image bright, but you don't want to make everything too bright. The brightest parts of this, we could look at this image here and say, hey, on this image here, yeah, we want to take this. This is way too hot. These lights are way too hot. We want to take the setup and bring the setup down. So we want to bring the setup down to about here. So it's setting up down there. And then we want to adjust the gain down so the gain falls right in here. But we want to take all of these, this whole midsection here, we want to bring this up and make this brighter. Well, gamma is going to do the control. It's going to keep this here, but kind of pull the middle, almost like a stretchy piece of fabric, to pull this up and make this brighter without extending this past broadcast safe. So we kind of just pull the middle up. And that's sometimes a nicer way to play the game. So we set our setup down at the bottom at 16. We set our gain up at 235, and then we can adjust our middle to be in a relatively decent place. So we have those controls. And that's a way of doing it. So you can use the controls for the HSL controls on the master. Now there also are controls for highlights, midtones, and shadows. And this would be to control just the shadow portions using the brightness and contrast and using gain, gamma, and setup. Now, before I make any mistakes, I could also say that, for example, this image here tends to be relatively orangey. And if I wanted to reduce some of the orange out of this image, or if we had some image here like this, it tends to look very blue, I could adjust the hue of this. And this would be a broad way of controlling the hue inside of here to say, let's pull away and make this less orangey. Now it's turning more green, now it's turning more purple, and I have a broad sword hue control that I can make some hue adjustments. I might not touch that, so I'm going to alt-click that. I'm actually going to turn it off and leave it off and there. And I can adjust the saturation. I can make this black and white. I can make this oversaturated. I have those controls there. But honestly, I tend to find that in here, I don't really mess with color. I don't necessarily love the HSL controls for adjusting hue. I guess for me, it's more of a luminance control, and I particularly like it there as a luminance control. And so I do have that. Now for this section here, I want to switch over to Hue Offsets and look at the controls. No, not the controls. I want to look at the Hue Offsets. And Hue Offsets show me my color wheels. And the color wheels are kind of fantastic. And I really like the color wheels. They break down in terms of categories of shadow, SHD, midtones, highlights, and master. And master would be the whole darned thing. So let me show you a little bit of how these work, and let's talk a little bit about color theory as an idea. So what you can do is you can say that this whole image, let's be honest, this whole image is relatively blue. This has a bluish tint. I can tell by my eyes this has a bluish tint, and I can see that this is relatively blue. If I didn't want to know by my eyes that it was relatively blue, I could look at some comparison. I could look at, say, the vector scope, the good old vector scope, and say that this is pulling a lot towards blue. Here over here is B for blue, and so this is CY for cyan, and this is G for green. If you've ever seen a vector scope before, this is a kind of a digital version of vector scope, and this is pulling a lot towards blue compared to, say, this image, which is pulling a lot towards red and yellow. It's very orangey, so it's pulling a lot more towards red and yellow, and we can see kind of how that looks. So I could say this is pulling a lot towards blue, and I can tell this image is relatively blue. And here on the master level, I could pull here and say, hey, this is blue, over here is blue. This little crosshair here, I could pull this away from blue. So I'm going to pull the energy away from blue. Now I'm going to do this drastically, and sometimes you do this. Sometimes you pull this really drastically and say, hey, let's pull this way away from here and see how we can make this. And we move this entire blob over here to orangey yellow. So we pulled this all the way to orangey yellow. We made the whole thing orangey yellow. And if this was some kind of post-apocalyptic, I don't know, some nuclear fallout scene or something, maybe this would work here. But we don't want to do that, so we're going to, again, option click this and go a little bit more gentle. And in this case, what we can do is we can pull this away from yellow and red and pull this here, and we can kind of change this image so it's less blue. Now, I would go in small increments. You can actually choose the angle of your degrees in here and the amount here, so you could actually, choose your amounts and go in small increments like that and go really small and really fine adjustments here. But if you wanted to, you could just pull this and pull this to whatever color you wanted to and pull this there. But that is adjusting all of the colors. And we don't know that all the colors are too blue. We don't know that everything is too blue. So let's take a look at my favorite way of doing color correction. And this is color correction for dummies. I'm going to hit Option, click this, and reset this back to there. And we're going to talk about color correction as an idea based on the numbers. So graphic images inside of a computer system are known as what are called RGB graphics, red, green, and blue. And here on the scope we have red, green, and blue, and basically all the colors here are made up of some combination of red, green, and blue. Well, I'm going to hop over here to Photoshop for a second. Now this is not a Photoshop lesson, so let's not get confused and assume it's a Photoshop lesson, but I do want to look at this image here of my kids on the back deck, roasting marshmallows, making some s'mores. And we can look at several different colors here. And so what I want to do is I want to look at this image here, and in this image I want to look at the color picker inside of Adobe Photoshop, which is lovely. And so this is the color picker inside of Photoshop, and I can pick on a color and I can choose some color like this green shirt. And I can say this green shirt is the color green. Well, this gives me in here the values of what this is in terms of red, green, and blue. And so the red, green, and blue values of this green shirt is 100 red, 120 green, and 67 blue. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, this is what's called RGB color channels, and all these pixels, all these dots inside of here. So if we zoom in super close here, and we said to zoom in super close and look at all the dots inside of here, we could zoom in and see that all these dots are made up of different colors, and everything inside of here is made up of different shades of different colors, and all those colors have values, and those values are broken down in terms of red, green, and blue values. So this is a shade of green right here, and this shade of green is 118 red, 144 green, and 96 blue. So imagine if you had a bunch of paint cans, all shades of red, and a bunch of paint cans, all shades of green, and a bunch of paint cans, all shade of blue. Now, this image right here is based on what's called 8 bits per channel. You'll see that sometimes in software, 8 bits per channel or 8 BPC. And 8 bits per channel has a range, and that range is 256 colors of each, or 256 shades of each color. So we have 256 shades of red, 256 shades of green, and 256 shades of blue that we can choose from. If you had 16-bit images, heck, you have more. You have, I think, what is it, 65,000 different shades, something like that? Yeah, the math gets crazy. Binary math. But in here, if we choose this, we can say that this is 100 versus 121 versus 64, and that's how much green this is. Again, if we hop out of here and we go to some other parts of this image here, and we say here, let's go back and zoom out for a second, and we look at some other things in here, we can say that, oh, this orange can probably is some shades of red, probably. A lot of shades of red here. Look at that, 156 red, 29 green, and 10 blue. Almost no green or blue in this whatsoever. Now, here's the math, and here's how this works. If this was 0 red by 0 green by 0 blue, it would be black. And that is your first color, basically. That is your first area of brightness. Is full black is 0 by 0 by 0. And I want you to think about that number, 0 by 0 by 0. If this was 255 by 255 by 255, it would be pure white. So pure white is 255 by 255 by 255. Now you're saying, but Chad, you said there was 256 colors, and that's only 255. Well, if we count 0 as a color, you know, you do the math. So we can do here. Now, if we do 255 by 0, we have a shade of red. And if we did 0 by 255 by 0, we have a shade of green. And if we did 0 by 0 by 255, we'd have a shade of blue as well. And if we did something like 200 by 0 by 200, we'd have a shade of magenta or purple. Because, you know, red and blue make purple. And that's how colors work. Now, that said, if we had a shade of, say, 180 by 180 by 180, we'd have a shade of light gray. Because it's not really white. White would be 255 by 255 by 255. We'd have a shade of light gray. And so here we have basically light gray inside of here. And if we had a shade of 40 by 40 by 40, we'd have a shade of charcoal, basically. Not fully black, not 0 by 0 by 0, but kind of fully black. Now, that said, if we had, for example, a shade of 200 by 180 by 180, we would notice that here, this is sort of gray, right? It's sort of gray with a little too much red in it. Because if it was fully gray, it would be 180 by 180 by 180. If it was 220 by there, it's a lot of pink in there. So there's a little bit too much pink in that image. So we can look at things that probably should be gray, or should be white, or should be black. So let's look at this image, and let's actually use the color picker and choose something that should be white. And we're going to look at my son's shirt here and say, oh, this part, I can tell this is white lettering. Let's look at this white lettering and see what's going on here. And we can see here, boom, okay, this is coming in at 192 by 180 by 250. Guess what? There's too much red in this image. And we can look at my neighbor's siding over here and say, oh, this should be white, right? But this is probably a shade of white, but guess what? This has 126 by 161 by 200. There's too much blue in this siding over here. And we can look at things that should be black. This should be black probably, but we click on this and say, oh, this is 19 by 9 by 7. Well, guess what? That's a little bit more red than there is green and blue. If this was fully black, if this was properly black or properly white or properly whatever color it's supposed to be, all those colors, all those numbers would be equal. My daughter's gray sweatshirt here. This is a shade of gray. It should be something like, I don't know, 120 by 120 by 120 or 160 by 160. I don't know, something like that. It's 149 by 132 by 148. Actually, it's pretty gray, except the green is a little bit low. So we could add a little bit of green there for this here. We could pick in random places here and see what we got here. So the red and blue numbers are coming in here pretty well. But on this side of it where the fire is, a lot of red here, a lot more red. But on this side of it here, these numbers are pretty accurate. But again and again, the green number tends to be a little bit low. So we can look at brightness, or we can look at color in terms of things that should be white or things that should be gray or things that should be black. Now, if we look at the fire right here, this fire right here is coming in at 254 by 255 by 253. Those numbers are pretty actually accurate. I mean, the whitest parts of the fire, this is pretty much fully white right there. So that is actually blown out properly white. I think this can back here is pretty good. Look at this, 26 by 26 by 24. That's pretty actually, you know, it's not fully black, it's not full black, but it's pretty even. Now, that said, we have a scale here of 0 to 255. So let's go back here and let's take a look back at, we'll hide Photoshop for a second. Again, this is not a Photoshop class. We'll go back here and we'll look at our waveform monitor. And our waveform monitor, just so we see, our waveform monitor here had a range of 16 by 235. Okay, here's the trick. The idea being is that on a computer system, you have 8 bits per channel. On an 8-bit per channel system, in 8 bits per channel, you have the possibility of going from 0 to 255. So if you can say that our darkest blacks can be 0 and our brightest brights can be 255, that is a 256 range of different brightness that you can be on a computer system. But the broadcast networks, your television networks, your broadcast things will not allow you to broadcast the brightest, whitest whites. And they will not allow you to broadcast the darkest blacks. They have to keep in a safe range to be safe on TVs. This was something that the FCC or the NTSC came up with years ago for a broadcast safe range. But when computer systems started to get involved in video, they said, hey, wait a minute. We can't be putting these bright computer whites on TV, so we have to keep you in a safe range. And there used to be a range called IRE, the Institute of Radiologic Engineers, came up with a range called the IRE range. And the IRE range was 7.5 to 100. Well, that's a weird number, 7.5 to 100. How does that make sense? That's bizarre. Well, I'll show you. If we go back here into the bins, I'm going to bring in some color patterns. I'm going to bring in some color bar test patterns just to show you. Now, I kind of wish that inside of Avid Media Composer there was a way to bring in some basic test patterns automatically. Basically, what you can do is you can go online, go onto the interwebs and look up test patterns and look up color bars, SMPTE patterns, whatever it may be. Pick your color bars that you like, pick whichever one you want, and just import them and just use them. Avid says we're not going to create a button that's like magically makes color bars because we kind of, whatever. You can just get them off the internet. And so just bring in a picture and set it for 30 seconds and whatever else it may be. If you're too lazy to go on the internet or you don't have internet access, I don't know, what are you doing to your life? But here, you can go to input and you can find these. And these are really tricky to find. I'm going to show them to you. Man, this is going to be a test. On Macintosh hard drive, which is my computer system, I can go to my applications folder. And I can go to my application folder. I can go to Avid Media Composer. In here, Avid Media Composer. Here we go. Supporting files. Yeah. And then test patterns. And here's a copy of SMPTE bars. SMPTE bars, it's a picked file. We're going to go in here and just link this in and say link. And there, and we'll bring this in. Boom. I'm linking this in here. Yeah, cool. bring in some empty bars. Cool. And it brought in these empty bars. Amazing. And here's a copy of empty bars. Oh, I made it really small. Sorry. Oh, let's delete those. Oh, I made a mistake. Mistakes will happen. That's too small. It brought in these too small because they were actually made, I think, those color bars have existed since SD. So let's do this again. Input source browser. We're going to go in here again. We're going to go into the empty bars, and I'm going to make sure to import and choose my import settings as resize image to fit format raster, or maybe just image size for record format. It's going to stretch this out a little bit, but it's just test patterns. We'll make this 30 seconds long. Cool. Let's bring some bars again. We'll import these in here. Amazing. Oh, much better. They look great. We're going to put these at the beginning. Just put these at the beginning here. We'll go to the beginning. We'll hit the home key, go to the beginning here, and I'm just going to mark it in point. I'm just going to grab in a couple seconds of this. Your broadcast network may want 30 seconds of bars, but this is why we put 30 seconds of bars so we can kind of test where our levels are supposed to be. So now we're going to look at 70 bars. We'll go back into color, and we'll look back at color. Oh, so take a look at this. Take a look at this. These are 70 bars here, and in these 70 bars here, these are coming in here. Basically, your white right here is coming in at 235, and this is, I think these are only 75% bars, so this is not coming fully there. If you wanted to, you could color correct your color bars, but that'd be kind of weird. And you'll see your different degrees. Over here, you'll even see what's called the plugge, this little line here, this line here, and this line up here. And this line represents this darker than black, black, and then lighter than black. So black should be here, basically there. Look like there's a little bit of a color adjustment there. So let's go back to controls. Let's open this up a little bit. Let's open up bring the setup down here. So it should look basically like this with this falling in there arranged. And this is the way the color bar should look, basically like there. And so this should be arranged. And if you actually clip this, you'll see that the bottom of this sub black here is there. We can kind of cross this and make this the same brightness as the other one. And we'll kind of crush this down to there. And so we can adjust this like there. So that's the way that color works. You will see that in terms of colors, your computer system can do, again, your computer system can do 0 to 255 if you're on 8 bits per channel. If you're working with standard video, standard HD video, you're working with 8 bits per channel or 24-bit video, you can do that amount of color. But if you are working with higher 16-bit or even, God forbid, 32-bit, you do have a greater color range, or at least more details in between your colors there, like so. So, great. But on a computer system, they're going to clip you at 16 and 235. Why do they clip you at 16 and 235? To make the broadcast networks happen, or make video standards for anything that's going out on video for TV at home. If you're going to the internet, I guess you can go above 16 by 235. You don't have to be broadcast legal safe. You don't have to make sure to scale yourself to legal range to be there. So that is your 16 by 235. But let's talk about color here for a second. So let's take a look at, say, this image here. So we've made the image brighter. We've controlled this to make the image brighter. I want to look at hue offsets for this. So now we have hue offsets for shadows, midtones, and highlights. So let's talk about this. And the way that I love to do this, one of my favorite things to do with this, is to use this guy. This guy is called the selected color to be changed in the current monitor and selected reference color. This is what's a color matching control. And it's a color matching control that works pretty well. I'm going to go over this super duper quickly and show you exactly what this does, but I do not want to spend too much time on this because I think this is kind of cheating. I mean, I guess it would work great, but I think it's not your best friend. So we can say, let's take a look at this, and we can do this. I'll just show you this really, really quickly, and then we'll pretend we never saw it again. You could say, I want to match this color to that color, and you could click on select the current monitor to be changed. We click on this, we choose this color. Boom, excellent. And it chooses that color. Oops. Sorry. Little window popped up, asked me some questions. We're going to choose that color. And then we choose another color to be changed, and we say color from what monitor we want to choose from, and then we say boom. And it's going to match this color to that color based on a master color control, and we say match it, and then we say cool, match color right here, match color button, and it's going to use the master controls to match this color to that color. And that would be a way we could match one color to another color. It moved this that much. And that's all it did for us. And that's great. But here's what I don't really want. I don't really necessarily want it to do that. What I want to do is I want to bring up this color info window. Now, I think I've talked about it before. I have a mixed relationship with this color info window. I don't really love it. It's always kind of clunky, and it sometimes brings up weird prompts, as you saw before, inside of a Mac system. But here's what I like about it. This color right here should be white. I know that this is a plaque that was on this counter and it should be white. I'm going to guess that this should be white. Well, if I look at this, even if I'm not smart enough to do color, I can look at this and go, hey, this should be white. And when I click on it, it says, hey, the color values of this, I'm looking the color values right here. The colors of values of this are coming in at 183 by 224 by 236. What is that telling me? That's telling me that the white values are more blue and more green than they are red. There's not enough red in the light values, in the white values. Things that should be white have a lot of green and a lot of blue in them. If I go anywhere in this image, I see 188 by 225 by 240. I see 180 by 217 by 230. I see 185 by 224 by 241. Yeah, in the whitest parts of this image, there's a lot of red. There's a lot of blue and green here. And so what I want to do is I want to look at blue. And I want to look at green, and I say, hey, in the highlight areas, I'm assuming the white is the highlight areas of this image, I'm going to pull away from blue and green. And I'm going to pull away from blue and green and pull more towards red. And if I pull again drastically, I'm going to get to make this whole thing red, which is the whitest parts of this image. But I just want to pull a little bit away from there. And now I'm going to grab this color picker again, and this color picker, I'm going to look again and see, okay, this is now coming in at 200 by 217 by 225. There's still a lot of green and blue in this. Let's pull this back. Close this window out here. We'll pull a little bit more towards red and get this to be here. And again, color picker again. Okay, I'm coming in like 197 by 203 by 212. I'm good on red and green. I may want to pull a little bit further away from blue and pull a little bit here and get this kind of like there. And my numbers are getting closer. My numbers are getting closer in amount here. And so I'm looking at these numbers and getting closer to an even number. I want this to be inside of this range. But I'm also noticing that these numbers are coming in at like 200, 209, 221, which means they're not really coming necessarily in the highlight areas. They may be coming in more the mid-tone areas. So, if you think that if 0 to 255, if, 0 to 80 is your shadow areas, and 80 to 160 is your something like that. 165 there is the midtone areas. I may want to adjust the midtone areas as well, but I can adjust this here and see what this is doing. Again, if I pull a lot, I can see, okay, I'm getting to 199, 188, 186. I've gotten this way too far in the reds. Let's pull back a little bit. I'm just kind of doing a little before and after. This is 194, 196, 201. Just a small degree of adjustments there. I'm at like 196, 197, 201. And that is maybe as close as I'm going to get. Would I want these all to be 200 by 200 by 200? Yeah, if it was perfectly white, it would be all 200 by 200. That may be as close as I might possibly get. But I can look here and just, close this here. So I can look at before and after. This is what it looked like before. This is what it looked like after. This is now getting closer to a shade of white here. Let's look at something that should be black in this image. So we're going to look at these pockets in here and say, okay, in these pockets in here, I'm getting 19 by 35 by 36. In the blackest parts of the image here, in the shadows here, I'm getting 27 by 49 by 35. There's a lot of green in here. Again, in the shadows, I may want to pull away from the blue and green and pull closer towards red, but maybe not as much as I did in the highlights. I don't necessarily want to do this as much in the highlights. I just want to pull a little bit here and check again. I don't trust my eyes. That's too much red. See, that's way too much red now. I don't trust my eyes. My eyes will lie to me. I'm going to go by the numbers. And this is kind of a little cheat here. I'm at 30 by 26 by 28. I think I'm pretty close. Maybe even a little bit less. Just to there. And I'm getting closer in terms of my values. There's a little too much red now. And again, a little bit of trial and error. That's pretty close. I feel like there's still a little too much red. We're going to pull this down a little bit. And just go in small increments until we get the numbers pretty even. Whoops. And just go here and pull this down a little bit less. Until I feel like, oh man, 32 by 39 by 35. I feel like that's as good as I'm going to get. Again, I want perfect layer, 27 by 29 by 29. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty even in terms of the shadow levels. So my shadow levels, I didn't pull them as drastically as I pulled my highlights. Now, what in here do I think would be gray? Maybe the tops of these, screw tops here. Again, on the tops of these screws in the darker charcoal areas, I'm getting close to even numbers. Still a little too much blue. So maybe I pull a little bit of red out of this way and pull a little bit there until I get a relatively balanced image. And again, I'm going to pull this till I get relatively a decent balance and get this here and get these numbers to be relatively equal and get this there. So there's my before and after with my hue offsets. That's what it looked like before. This is what it looks like cleaned up. And so I have a little bit better going on in terms of how I've adjusted this image. And I guess this would be everything. This would be what it looked like before. Oops, let me turn this back on. This would look like now, and so I have a relatively well-balanced image. So if you have something in your image that is, equal parts black, white, and gray, if you have some gray parts of your image, you can do some pretty decent color correction with some hue offsets. But it's sometimes easier than trying to eyeball this to look at the numbers. Now, we'll look at this another different way. We're going to go over to another part of this, another clip here. We'll grab this one right here. And again, we'll look at this here clip, and we'll park on this one, and we'll look in, for now we're going to look in waveform. We'll look at waveform. And over here, I'm going to look at a control here, and we'll look at this image in terms of what's called, one of my favorites is the RGB Parade. And the RGB Parade looks like this. And the RGB Parade is kind of weird. It shows basically the waveform broken down in terms of color channel. So it's this thing, but kind of squeezed in here and squeezed in here and squeezed in here. So we have that as an option. So now we can look at this image and say, okay, let's take a look at this image. We don't necessarily have anything that is actually perfectly white. We do have some spots in here that are pretty dark. This may be white, but this is definitely, I think this is probably standard gray paint. But again, if we look at this and say, okay, this is coming in 147 by 132 by 126. It's very more red than anything else. This in the dark spots here is 37 by 24 by 22, and these dark spots down here we have 41 by 23. So there's obviously, if we look at this image, a lot more orange or red in this image than we have in there. And we can see that in the waveforms because this is the amount of red energy, this is the amount of green energy, and this is the amount of blue energy. Now, we see that we have a little bit more red in the dark because this is raised up. In the darker parts of this image, we have a little bit more red than we have green and blue. And we have actually the littlest blue. So here in the shadow areas, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into here, and I'm just going to pull towards blue. So we're going to pull more towards blue, and you can see that these levels will adjust at the bottom. So I'm pulling the bottoms to make these kind of even. There we go. Look, they look pretty even to me. Great. Excellent. Let's look in the let's look in the highlight areas, and we're going to look in the highlight areas, and I see that I have this little V here, and I have this little V here, and I have this little V here, and I want to make these highlight areas raise the blues while lowering the reds a lot and lowering the greens a little bit less. So we're going to pull away from the reds, and we'll pull here like this, we'll pull like there, and we'll go here and say, let's pull this to raise this up. Now notice what I'm doing is I'm actually barely touching this part right here because this is not really hitting anywhere decent. You can see at the very, very tip tops at the lights, I'm basically leveling these lights out, but that's not doing a lot of work here. So it's really, there's not a lot going on in the highlight areas of the range. Now, if I were to go back to controls and raise up the internal gamma here, I could raise up the internal gamma and raise everything up to that area to be up here. And then the hue offsets would in fact probably adjust the tops of these more, but they're not really doing a lot of work here. So let's put my controls back into my gamma back to where it was, something there. So it's kind of just in the middle. Excellent. Let's look at hue offsets and let's look at midtones. And now I want to adjust the midtones to make these look somewhat even. And so here I'm going to pull this there like so and pull this here and get this somewhat even. Notice I haven't pulled in enough green, so I'm going to pull more towards the green and get these to kind of fall basically to where they're somewhat even. So now that's my before and after right there. There's my hue offsets of there to there, making this look less orangey. Now, that said, if we're being honest, there's a lot of orange in this. This is a lot of clay, in this image. You know, I might be okay with some of this. I don't want to look too, you know, boring and not orangey. It's going to be orangey in the room. So now I have to kind of almost, you know, debate, you know, what I want this to look like in terms of balancing this versus what I want this to look like in terms of stylistic look, I guess. But that may be an afterthought. Again, we can look at this image and we can look at this again. A lot of blue in here. So let's look at the blue in the shadow areas. This is way too high. So let's try to bring the shadow areas closer to red, take the blue out, put it there. Could we adjust the controls here and say, yeah, let's bring the contrast down and bring the, let's get rid of the brightness and contrast adjustment we did. And let's play with gamma, gain, and setup again. I really like those. I think they're easier. Bring setup down, we'll bring gain up. Okay, so now we feel pretty good about the range there, like so. And in some places, you know, maybe we have a slight little dusting here. And I don't know if the dusting is really a big issue, but now we have this pretty decent. Let's go to the hue offsets here, and let's look at the shadow areas. So the shadow areas seem like we're going to make sure they match to a decent point. We're going to look at the highlight areas here and grab the highlight areas. Obviously, away from blue, we want to bring the blue down, bring the red up. So we're going to bring more towards red and drag more towards red until these are too much green, too much green. Kind of like a video game here. I'm going to match these so they match pretty evenly. Great. Let's look at the mid-tone areas, and I see that this red here and this green here, there's a little like, I don't know, something in there. There's a little something in there that looks a little bit too much of one thing. So let's try to bring the blue down, the green down by pulling towards the red and adjusting that to be a relatively well-balanced image. So now here in the hue offsets, you can see the difference between this and this is a different level of balance. And so you have those basic balance controls that you can adjust those, etc., like so. Again, you do have controls to go in here and play the matching game. And you could play the matching game where you could match something so it matched some other color, etc., and use those controls there. You can match the master, you can match to just the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. You could match just exclusively those places only. Down at the bottom here with the hue offsets, you do also have a control for auto balance, auto black, auto contrast, and auto white. So you could use an auto white adjustment, an auto balance, and auto contrast. But these four buttons down here for auto balance, auto black, auto contrast, and auto white, these adjustments are the software deciding what it thinks is appropriate. So we could look at, say, for example, this image here and say, hey, let's look at this image here and let's let this be adjusted by the system. So we have controls here. We did some adjustments for brightness here, but we're going to just undo those. We're just going to alt-click and say, get rid of those. Alt-click and just get rid of everything. Now we're going to go here and say, let this decide what this should be. In hue offsets, we're going to decide what this should be in terms of auto contrast. So we're going to auto contrast and see what it does. Oh, it did okay. Auto balance. Yeah, I mean, it balanced some degrees. Do I like that? Auto white, I could use auto white and just see what it looks like. Okay, so I did some auto. Yeah, I guess that's okay. We could look at it before and after and see, you know, but again, that's the software just looking at the pixels and saying, hey, let's just make this what it is. I don't know if that's great or not. So these controls are there if you're, you know, want to work simply and have a simple control to make some simple adjustments. But if you really want some more robust controls, you could go in here and say, do it yourself and really dial those in. But sometimes these are nice to actually give you a sense of, okay, this image they pulled a lot more towards blue because there was a lot of, in all these they pulled a lot more towards blue in terms of matching this, and they played a little bit with some degrees there, etc. So there is some things you can do with there. But I sometimes use these as a starting point to just give myself a reference of like, okay, what would the computer do if the computer was smarter than me? But clearly I'm smarter than the computer. Of course I am, yeah. And so what would the computer do and how would it balance these images? Okay, it would do this. Obviously, that's the direction I want to go into. That's a kind of a decent starting point. Now, if you don't want to use, we're going to option click this. If you don't want to use the controls, you could say go into curves. A lot of people like curves. I actually really like the curves inside of Avid. One of the issues that I've always had with the curves inside of Premiere is the curves don't actually show you what the colors are looking at, and they don't actually show you the values there. This has a color-coded mentality, which I really like a lot better. This is a lot prettier in there. The way the curves work, just if you've never worked with curves before, they do have a control. So here's my advice. If you're going to use HSL controls, use HSL controls. If you're going to use curves, use curves. Leave HSL controls alone. Don't touch them. Don't mess with them. We're going to take this image, for example. We're going to go here and say, let's remove this effect. We're going to clear this out, and we're going to start here. So inside of curves, we do have a master gain, a master gamma, and a master setup. So we do have some of those controls there inside of curves. What you shouldn't do, again, is you shouldn't start messing with here and then going and then undoing everything you did here or everything you did here. Like you shouldn't, like you're going to be, butting heads basically. And so you don't want to do that. But what we want to do is we want to say, okay, let's go here. Let's look at this image. Let's bring our setup down. We can go here and say, let's bring the setup down a little bit. Not that low, maybe just to there. And we'll bring our master gain up and brighten this up so we get just a light dusting at the top there. Cool. We can even, control that a little bit there. At most, I might go back to HSL controls and just throw the clip on and have the clip be doing the clip work. I'm going to option click this and just go back to here. So we're going to say turn the clip on and have a clipping just to be safe, and we'll go to curves. Again, we'll go here and say inside of there, we can make those adjustments, etc. like there. And that will reflect, back. So I believe that a change we make here will also change here. So that's kind of nonetheless. So we have those controls to change the gamma and this bring the setup down. Whoops, not that low. And we'll raise. Come on, you can do it. Again, small increments, very small increments. We're going to raise that just so it's right there. And we'll raise the gain up so it gets this thing brighter. And then we're going to be here. And so we're going to be there like so. But now we have controls for adjusting the colors of the red, green, and blue channels at different places. So this almost works like Hue Offsets, but kind of a different way. Hue Offsets basically said, okay, we have shadows, midtones, and highlights, and we can change the colors of those areas. Now we have the colors themselves, and we can change those. So if we want to change the highlights of this image, if we want to change the highlights of this image away from red, and again, we have our color chooser, we can choose, look at this thing that should be white and say, okay, there's a lot more red and green. We can look at the highlight areas, and we can grab this little knot up here, and this little knot up here, we could pull this away from red. Think of this as the darker parts of the image, and this is the brighter parts of the image. Well, we want the brighter parts of the image to pull away from red, and that's going to pull the brighter parts of the image away from red. And you see, I'm killing the brightness up top here. Look at the RGB Parade. I'm killing the brightness here from the red. And so I'm taking this away from the red and putting that there. And then I could say, oh, let's take the darker parts of the image, and just for example here, we're going to grab the darker parts of the image and raise the darkness over towards the green, and it's going to raise the bottom of this. But notice it's raising up everything. As I raise this up here, I can raise it up there. And the fun of curves is that more than just a shadow, midtone, highlights, which is only basically 3 points it's pulling from, you can make dots across here. And you can say, instead of pulling at whatever we said shadow was, 0 to 80 or whatever, and 80 to 160 or 160 to 250. Instead of pulling from those ranges, we can pull from exact places. So here we can say, okay, we want the reds. So let's take a look at another image here, just for example here. We're going to go to this. We're going to go back to this and see this as though it were in its poor shape that it is. So here we're going to do the same thing with curves. So we're going to look at this and say, okay, let's take a look at this, and let's go here. And let's say, for example, on this image here, we're going to look and say, let's first, let's brighten this up, and we can use the master control to brighten this up. This is your contrast control. This is deliberately your master control is your contrast control. Let's raise this up here, so we can make this brighter at the top. And so here, if we raise this here, we can make this brighter at the top. And we can make this darker at the bottom. We're going to make this darker at the bottom, and we're kind of making a sharper contrast just from there to there. That's really easy and really nice. And so now we're bringing this brighter top and bottom. If we wanted the mid-range to be brighter, we could click here and make a dot and bring the gamma up. Notice we're going to bring the gamma up in the bottom here. And now we're bringing the middle of this. But if we wanted this to be, and this is the trick, if we wanted this to be, well, that's awful. If we wanted this to be here, we're going to delete that guy. what we can sometimes do is that what I sometimes do with this is I'm going to create this back here where it was. This is a straight angle, so this is the regular brightness that goes across here. We're going to click a point here. We're going to make the dark parts dark and make the bright parts bright. And we're making this bright, kind of pulling not from the very top, but just from the middle top. And we're making this kind of curve that's not going exceeding. It's not going to, if we went like this, we would, you know, peak out basically. But here, we can pull this here, and that gives us basically what's called a contrast curve. And so we have this just inside of there. So it's not going to, it's only going to as black as it is, and it's only going to white as it is, but it's just kind of creating a nice, sharper contrast. So we have some really kind of rich contrast there in terms of there. Well, now let's look at our color here. And we can do the same thing with our color. At the very top of this, we can pull the blue down. So we're going to pull the blue down a little bit and get the top of this down to here. So we're going to pull down there. We're going to do the red. We're going to pull the red up a little bit and bring up the red so the red is even right there. At the bottom, but the bottom of these, they seem like they're okay. The red could come up a little bit in the bottom. So at the bottom of this, we could say, hey, let's pull the red up a little bit so it's even. And automatically, I mean, man, automatically that's a pretty well-balanced image. Curves are great to get a really nice, even amount of balance. Now, I don't like this section here because I feel like there's some, these two are higher than this red. So let's figure out what this red is. This is 16, 70, 125, 180, 235. Let's try to pull that up at 70. And I don't know where 70 is. Is that shadows? Well, I don't care. I'm going to pull this here and pull up there. And you're going to see I'm going to pull up like this and pull that up even so it's even like that. So if I want more kind of finite control, and I can actually make multiple dots and pull this back, because you can see as I pull one, it pulls up everything in that range. I don't want to do that. I want to have more, you know, minute control over this so that these are all even. And that's good old camera white balancing. The idea of balancing the image. I have controls to control really small ranges, not just shadows, midtones, and highlights, but really detailed ranges of brightness based on color. And so I can look at another image here, for example. We can look at, let's look at this image here, and we can see, oh, this is going to be fun. So we're going to look at this and say, okay, let's go here. We have our contrast range. So here, we're going to bring this down. We'll make this a little bit darker here at the bottom. We'll bring this down to the bottom. I think the tops are okay. I think the tops can come maybe up like that. So we have a good range to work with here, and we have some good details to work with. And we can look at this and say, okay, so this image, you know, let's take this. Let's take the blues down. So we're going to bring the blue down at the darker range. This is mostly, there's a lot of blue going on. We could just broadsword bring all the blue down. That might be a way to work. But let's just bring the blue down here. Click a point. I'm just clicking to add a point. Clicking a point there. We'll bring this down here like this. Now we can kind of control that a little bit here. This piece is a little bit higher than this piece, so in the reds, we can pull this red up right here. And the tops of the reds can go a little bit higher as well. So now we're kind of making sure that all this is exactly the same. All these points are exactly the same. I feel like I can pull the red down a little bit here. Click a point. And you can see I have I'm looking at different controls here to make these match. I might want to pull it down here, but I don't want it to be too low. Or maybe the green can come down a little bit on the bottom. And I want to kind of even these out. And man, all of a sudden, man, that just looks like a totally different image. Look at how nice that looks. That's great. I really like the RGB Parade. It gives me a sense of really what I'm looking at in there. And I can look at different points. So imagine that this is the 16s, this is the 70s, this is the 125s, this is the 180s. And you could look at this line and say this is 16, this is 70, this is 125, this is 180, this is 255. And you can look at those kind of different points and say, hey, I can make minute adjustments in this image to make the color do what I really want it to do. That said, there are all kinds of color correction controls that you can do inside of here. And there's all different ways you can cut out different parts with shapes. And this is, again, in the ultimate version. And there's also other things you can do with secondary color correction. And secondary color correction is ways that you can pick different colors of different shades and say, I want to make this red truck blue, and I can change the colors of just that range. And that's what's called a secondary color correction. There's also other ways of doing color correction and other scopes you can look at. You can look at other things. In here, you can look at the histogram, which is always weird to me, how the histogram works in terms of there. And so there's other different methodologies you can look at in terms of brightness. This actually has an IRE scale. The YC waveform has an IRE scale that goes from 7.5, again, 7.5 being your bottom and 100 being your high. There's tons of other color correction we can do. But if you've ever been afraid of color correction and didn't know what to do inside of color correction, this is your ground floor. This is your introduction into color correction. I recommend using this color picker to see what your color's doing. But also, man, the RGB Parade, what a great friend to tell you how things should be done. If you want to go for a color look, you want to go for some kind of crazy LUT or something else, some kind of stylistic look there, you can make day for night and stuff in here. You can do all that as an afterthought. But first, what you probably want to do is probably just correct this so it looks good. But this image, man, we did some good work here. We did some good work to make this look even. That's the way this should look. Anyway, that's all we're going to cover for today. Maybe we'll do some more color correction in the future, but it's something you can continue to explore. And again, am I great at it? Nope. But I can definitely do this. All right, I'll talk to you guys soon.